Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great time to jump into that.
A segue.
Perfect timing.
Yeah.
Because really, in this context, it's about looking at the bigger picture, having faith, but doesn't necessarily have to be religious faith, and looking for meaning and purpose in what has happened, which is different from finding the logic and the understanding.
Yeah.
Even though they're both a little abstract, this one
It's a bit more nebulous in a sense. It doesn't have any concrete answers, whereas the thinking has more, can be a wee bit more concrete.
And finding meaning is often very personal.
Yes.
So only you will, the meaning you find may not be some other meaning that anyone else will find as well.
Yeah. And I find like this is my dominant extroverted intuition, being an ENFP. And I find that, like sometimes it's even hard to put logical words onto it. And maybe that's because I've got that N and F combination going on rather than the N and T with a but you just know. There's just something in Yeah.
It's just knowing. Just knowing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so like getting people to be able to put words on stuff can be hard at times. But like they're looking at the bigger picture, and often these people, that do have a religious faith, or even if they don't, they still. I find it really interesting. Even if people don't have a personal religious faith, and maybe this is because it's our cultural faith historically as Europeans, but they often will talk about what their loved one's doing in heaven with God, or not even with God, with others, with all the other family members that have gone before them, and they talk about being up there, and and it is that whole of the spirits coming together again.
You're right, and people do take a comfort in the sense of people being joined together in this other place.
Yeah, in another world, that this is not the end of life. Yeah.
And you mentioned finding the gift in the situation earlier in our talk. And I know some people find it difficult, particularly with grief of a loved one who's quite young, to find that sense of a gift. And so is it essential? Is it because some people think, well, there isn't a gift in this situation. How can I possibly think of there being a gift? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, good question. I think an interesting point. I think it's not always like finding the gift. For example, my nephew was killed in an accident at 18. And I mean, that's now over 10 years ago. Like, there's no way that we look at that and think his death was a gift. But the beautiful gift that's come out of that was just is the way people cared and the way it brought the community together. Like his funeral just was phenomenal because there was all these school kids, like there was over 1,000 at the funeral, and and just of all these people coming together. And so there's aspects of beautiful gifts in there, that are a gift within it. So his death, I mean, all of us would want him still here, but
I think that's a really good distinction to make, looking at the gifts that's come out of a situation, even if the situation itself was not a gift.
Yeah. And I think there are gifts in the situation. I think there will always be gifts in the situation. But telling somebody that within the first few days or weeks when they're absolutely in the shock, well, what is the gift in this? I mean, it's probably a bit insensitive. It's looking back and finding that.
And I think, as you've just said, it's one of the ways in which people want other people to get over their grief faster. Yes. If you can see the gift, you don't need to grieve anymore. You'll be done. Actually, no, that's maybe eventually months or years down the track. But right now I've got to, go through whatever it's going on right now.
And I think, like right at the beginning, you talked about the 2 tracks of sometimes feeling, this is really bad, and other times feeling the excitement of the future. It's the same, I think, that there can still be gifts when things are really, really bad. There can still be hope when, the night's at its darkest. And it's appreciating that. And I think probably those that connect into the spiritual side of things, and we're all spiritual beings, we're all physical beings, we're all emotional, psychological beings, we're all spiritual beings. So I think that's where hopefully our world is coming into a more balance of just seeing that is not formalized religion. But for some it is. Like, I know, I'm down in earthquake country in Canterbury, and it was really hard, like for one of the women I know, that her husband had died years before. Then since the earthquake, the church that he had his funeral with, and that she personally was really connected with, had to be demolished because of the earthquake. And she fought it and fought it and fought it, but nobody ever asked her why she was fighting it. And I said to her one day, so tell me why the church was so important. And she said, after her husband's death, and it was a premature death, he died of cancer prematurely, she said there was a stained glass window up the front of the church that the light came through. She said, I would just go and sit in that light, and it just bathed me, it restored me, it gave me hope. And so you can sort of see, while, you can understand she had a whole spiritual link to that going on. So, while people had thought, well, the building's just a building, is just a building. The building wasn't just a building, but a building, for her. It was so much more. Yeah.
And I suppose on the same vein, I read about people losing their faith in their religion and in God.
You're right.
When some of these things happen. How does that factor into the grieving process?
Well, I know, another rally that was in the war, in the Second World War, and he just came back, and he lost his faith, never ever gained it back again. And he says, I cannot believe in a God with seeing what I saw. And and people do, because I think God's let them down. And and whereas others go through exactly the same situation and feel God walking with them in it, and I think, again, that could be to do with personality. He was a very sensing type, so he wouldn't necessarily feel that spiritual presence with him, whereas other people would talk about that they did, in the most horrendous situations, just have that spiritual presence that they knew was with them. So it seems that it either takes people's faith away or it draws it stronger. But from my perspective, who has a belief in God, I don't actually think that's a big deal. I think, God's big enough. He's not going to fall off the throne if that's going to happen, and so I think it's actually journeying with people in their reality. Yeah.
So we've got a few different ways here that people can grieve spiritually. Some of these we've mentioned already, but I just want to talk about some of this. We've got volunteering and activism and a lot of creativity, this writing and photography, because some people find it really helpful. They want to feel like they're doing something or honoring people or giving back in some way. How does these, and maybe you have a few examples, like how does this help people process their grief?
Well, the immediate one that comes to my mind is a young woman I've worked with a lot that I met first when she had a full-term stillbirth. And so lost her baby at full term, no answers, just, Then her partner left her because he just couldn't cope with her emotional response. I mean, what's beautiful is they have remained good friends. But then as she carried on, and like she was dominant in this area, so just really wanted to look for meaning. For a start, she did a lot of lighting of candles. She played a lot of music. She did a lot of artwork, drawing, and did a lot of meditation, a lot of prayer. I mean, and God had not featured in her life before that, but she then did pray to God, because for her, what was really important was to know that her baby was looked after by the angels. And so she would pray a lot in that direction. But then, as within a few months, actually, maybe a year, she started volunteering with SANS, stillborn and newborn death. And she did a lot of volunteering with them and became very, very involved for quite a few years. And then there was just a point she knew she needed to stop. It was pulling her back. And I think that's not uncommon. And you see a lot of people, they'll volunteer at the hospice after having lost a loved one at the hospice, or you see a lot with Pink Ribbon with the breast cancer survivors. They want to do that. And I think it can be different types can do that. Like I know there's a woman locally, and she's just making the most amazing quilts. She had breast cancer. She's a survivor of breast cancer, and she was so moved and appreciated the support through Breast Cancer Society that she now makes quilts, so that people have quilts on their bed when they're going through chemotherapy and and going through that to keep them warmer. And something physically she can do.
And I think it's interesting that the point you made, that after a while people notice that it's bringing them back, and then it's time to move on to the next thing, that it's a chapter that helps them with that grieving process.
And I wonder too, and this is just a wonderment, I've done no research on this, but I wonder if for sensing types, doing something practical that's helpful for others, they might get into that routine of doing that for years and years, forever. Whereas intuitives are always wanting naturally to move on to the next thing. They've got their eyes always focused on the future. And I wonder if volunteering for a period of time might work just for them better than making it feeling like they have to do it forever.
I've picked up a few stories along the way. I remember reading about a woman whose, I think it was husband, passed away, and she had a bear, like a teddy bear, and for some reason that was meaningful, and she traveled the country taking photos of this bear in different places and made a children's book out of it. And just that process both helped her grieving and then helped others as well.
Yes. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, they want to help others. They felt so helped themselves. And I think that's again where the gift has been. Like this woman locally who's making the quilts, like her experience of going through breast cancer was horrible, but the gift in it, that she just finds such a gift now of making these quilts. And like she charges nothing. She just goes to op shops and gets old sheets and material and just makes up all these patterns. It's just and she just loves it. And it's like it's almost given her meaning and purpose in her life now.
And I'm looking at the music one. I mean, obviously sometimes writing music is like writing poetry, and that can be really, really powerful, but also just listening to music that relates to that person or to that thing or that time in your life can help you connect to, to the meaning and the grief and as well.
Yes, you're right. And that can come back years later. Yeah, I remember listening to the radio on my way home one time from work, and this piece of music came on that was a piece of music we played in my nephew's funeral, years later. And next minute, I'm turning the music up really loud, winding down the minute and tears pouring down and like if anybody had seen me. But it was actually really cathartic. And it was just nice to remember him again. And, and again, that's, I think, you don't actually get over somebody's loss. You actually learn to live with it. And sometimes, it gets to the stage, while that was painful early days, it becomes a gift in later days. And music there's something that taps into our memory with music, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, it's able to, I feel like it can act like smells. It can access the subconscious a lot faster.
Yes. Yeah, like smells. And speaking of smells, that's a really interesting thing, is that a smell can be what is so important for people. And I know of people that they have not thrown out their partner's pillow because it has their smell in it. And and it just does that connecting again.
Yeah. And same with possibly like aftershaves and perfumes and stuff as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Now I've got rituals on here, and it's not something we've talked about a lot, or some people like may not think about the power of ritual, because ritual can mean all sorts of things, but it's a way of like connecting the past to the present to the future in some sort of physical act that has meaning for you. And have you used or seen any rituals yourself?
I think that probably the most common rituals I have seen are around lighting candles or attending church services. I know not since I've moved south, but when we're up north, I always ran a remembrance service at Christmas, and like a lot of the people that came, it had been years and years since their partner had died or their friend had died, but just doing that ritual every year, it was almost as if they didn't do that Christmas wasn't Christmas, because it invited their loved one back into Christmas. Or like I know often a little ritual around at their birthdays, having their favorite dessert or one of their favorite meals, and it becomes, because you're doing a ritual, only becomes a ritual because you're doing it time after time. And so I think that can be it can be whatever people make it, really. And I think in our context in New Zealand, again, because I think of our culture, people often don't always feel free to be able to say that, because you should have got over that. That was years ago, whereas it can just be a really healthy ritual.
Yeah, I've been making a point of just bringing it up in everyday conversation, but without necessarily making an implication that I want to talk about it. It's just like, well, I'm obviously still grieving at the moment, and that being it, I'm not asking anything from them, but I'm just letting people, just still communicating that this is not a quick thing. It does take time.
Well, it's really interesting today, just looking back on stuff, and that it was, it's like 2 years today since we moved into our property here, which is something we celebrate. But it's also 6 years since we had to have our little dog put down. And I thought, oh man, and like I still miss him so much. I mean, we've just not got the lifestyle now to be able to have a dog. But like he was old and he was unwell, and we were recommended that we put him down. But it was sort of like 6 years ago, and I still miss him. And he, like, people say, but he's just a dog. He was not just a dog.
Pet owners do not agree with that at all. They're like, they're family members. It's the same thing.
They so are family members.
Definitely.
And it's not like every day I'm sitting, I can't move because I'm grieve the dog, but I just still feel sad that we don't have him.
Mm.
Yeah, because he was an important member of our family.
Something we haven't spoken about much is anniversaries. And by that, I don't necessarily mean anniversaries like birthdays, or that's included, but sometimes grief anniversaries we can sometimes feel things very strongly on an anniversary that we don't associate with anything, because we might have forgotten that this was a particular day where something particular happened. How do we navigate those? Like how do we start to be aware of some of these other anniversaries beyond? I think it's a twofold question, because obviously there's birthdays and Christmas and all those sorts of things where it's, there's something you want to bring in that wasn't there before, but also these grief anniversaries that we may not have pinpointed.
Yeah, and I think it is acknowledging them. I think it seems to me that a lot of people, especially in a death, they will acknowledge the anniversary for the first year, and they build themselves up for it. And, and most people feel that they've navigated that okay. But then it's a second year when they think, I got over it last year, we did well last year. And so they don't prepare. And then it just is like this tsunami over them. And so, yeah, I do think there is that whole point that if somebody has whatever anniversary it is, that they actually acknowledge it some way, even just by lighting a candle or picking a flower or whatever works for you. But I think there's also acknowledging anniversaries, like realizing that if this is the anniversary that your relationship broke up, because I think the difficult thing about a relationship breakup is a living grief, and it's often put on you, even if you're part of making that joint decision. It's not always what your hopes and dreams were. So it's sort of remembering, if that day stands out in your mind, then you can say, okay, so what do I need to be kind to myself? How do I actually show some self-compassion and some self-empathy for that day? Like if you knew that it was your best friend's the anniversary of her marriage breakup or something, and that she could be feeling it, you'd probably go and do something with her. So what can you do with yourself? Or the other side is that you might be celebrating it. So actually break open a bottle of bubbly, or, it's acknowledging it, isn't it?
And just in some small way can just help connect all the things that are going on.
Yeah. Well, especially if you're feeling a bit antsy inside and you're not quite sure why you are. Just taking that time and think, okay, what does this date represent for me? And what do I need to care for myself in it?
Anything else we want to say about ways we grieve spiritually?
Yeah, it's just emphasizing again that it's much wider than religious stuff. Yeah, and that we are all spiritual beings. And actually, even, sometimes the spiritual thing is just sitting out in creation, sitting out in nature as well, and I think that's where photography helps. But yeah, Yeah,
and that's one thing we haven't got on here, is just sitting at the beach or sitting out in the forest, just communing can sometimes be very powerful.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we've gone through those 4 ways of grieving, for those listening, you might have a sense of what your natural style is and start to ponder that. But also we're going to talk about getting unstuck. And so we're going to look at what our dominant way might be, but also why we might get stuck and what that might look like. So, I
think if you're feeling stuck, if you just feel it, I do know that when I worked at the hospice, I'd talk to people and they say, I'm just not coping. And I'd say to her, what do you mean by not coping? I'm just feeling overwhelmed. I can't think, I can't do this, I can't do that. And I'd say, are you up? Yes. Are you dressed? Yes. Have you had breakfast? Yes. you're coping. And it's actually being gentle for yourself, especially in those first few weeks. And it's also understanding that grief has patterns and highs and low times. For example, in that around 3-month time is often when people will hit their lowest. So they can sort of think, oh man, I've got through all the shock of this initial, loss, and I've been doing it generally okay. And then they just hit rock bottom, and they just feel like they're going crazy. People aren't going crazy. That's normal. They will come back out of it, and there'll be other times that they'll hit other more little lows. I mean, this is in general, of course, but it's understanding that. But I think if you do feel stuck, it's coming back to like the PowerPoints here and looking at, okay, which was my style? Do I need to look at any of those? Or if you feel like you've got that, no, it's not the issue, just go through the others and say, are there any ways that one of these, do they feel like that's what I need to do?
Yeah. And that sometimes we might need to do all 4 of them.
Yeah, I think it's probably hard to do all 4 at once, but I think in weaving them in.
Yeah. I was more thinking that if you're grieving for a very long time, over time, definitely. You might you'll use all. Yeah. Yeah.
And I know, like, my order of preferences, and this is a bit deeper into the type stuff, is first of all intuition, and then feeling, and then thinking, and then sensing. And so, but it's almost as though I know in my significant grieving times, if I've been able to tick the top one of finding meaning, the spiritual intuition side, then the others almost are a bit more like dominoes that fall. But then there are times that I just want to go and do something physical, in remembrance of something, or, so it's very fluid. I think, you do practice all 4 styles, but it's sort of looking at them and saying, what am I being drawn to? What's inviting me in here?
Yeah. My grandmother passed away last year, and it was both a relief and a gift, and but all still very sad and all of those things. And so at the time, grieving that didn't feel as big as some of the other griefs I had at the same time. But at Easter was something I really hold really strongly about grandma, and she always gave us these chocolate eggs, and Easter Sunday was always important for her. And so I sat down, I just had this instinct that I wanted to write to her, I wanted to journal. And so I just wrote a letter just talking to her, and I think through that process, you also cover off things that you might have wanted to say that didn't, and hopes and dreams. And that just naturally came up almost, 9 months later.
Yeah.
Or even almost a year later, that I hadn't necessarily thought of doing earlier, but it turned out to be a really wonderful process. And it might be a ritual I repeat for the next few years on Easter Sunday, because it's a day I associate with her and her memory.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful example. Yeah, and it's a wonderful gift to her too. It just keeps that relationship alive, doesn't it? Because I remember somebody saying, we often think that we are physical beings that have spiritual experiences. The reality is we are spiritual beings that for a period of time have a physical experience. And I think it gives permission to keep that relationship alive. Yeah, because I mean, they say that grief is the process of going from loving in the presence this is with death, loving in the presence to loving in the absence.
Oh, I like
that.
Yeah,
and it gives you permission of how do I still carry on loving her when she's not physically in this world anymore.
Yeah, and so I was thinking about, where do I get stuck? And so obviously, I start with meaning, And sometimes that can come a bit easily, but I can get stuck on the logic. You know, I spent a lot of time last year saying, I don't understand. I don't understand why this happened. I mean, I understood it, but I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
It was almost like I was being too logical, but the logic wasn't working. And so it was this conflict of logic in a way. And for big feeling stuff, because feeling is my third approach, I did need a counselor or a therapist to talk it through because I couldn't process any of that inside.
Yes.
And so I had to go and talk to someone. But that's not always the case. It's almost like when I get stuck on the logic, there's usually a feeling associated with it. And if you can work on them both at the same time with someone, you can start to shift that.
And also that your feeling function is extroverted. So, trying to work it out by yourself can be quite hard.
Yeah.
So having somebody else to work through that process, and then you'd probably, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to make an assumption that could be quite wrong. It's almost as though then you actually analyze that feeling through your thinking process.
Most likely.
But I think that's quite healthy for your type. Yeah, because it's almost like you need to understand that feeling from a logical point of view. And give it permission.
And often, and I think this is where sometimes you can almost get stuck with your not being able to grieve in your dominant way, is that I will often walk out of the therapist's office and make connections that I just wouldn't have made on my own that gave meaning. And I'm like, okay, I can see the meaning for this now. So it's I like this way of thinking about grief because sometimes you know that you're stuck, but it's hard to know exactly what to do to get unstuck.
And I think what I like about what you're saying there is that it can be really helpful going to talk to somebody. I mean, you're an extrovert, but you're and so talking through your thinking function is introverted, so it's working out those frameworks of where it all fits, but your third function is extroverted feeling, so you do need to sometimes talk, and it's giving yourself permission to do that because it's really healthy.
Yeah, I've got a journaling process where you answer like prompts, and I find that really powerful for getting into emotions that I wouldn't naturally get into. And as someone who doesn't like to cry, as a thinker who doesn't like to, express too many emotions in public, that is really useful, but it has a limit. As someone who's not a dominant feeler, it has a limit, and there comes a point where I actually have to talk to someone because it's just not a skill set I have for the bigger things.
Yeah. And it's appreciating that all of us have those bigger things that happen that we just can't deal with by ourselves, and I think it takes us back to, we need a community around us, and that can be friends and professionals in grief. None of us were born as an isolated island. We can't do life by ourselves.
No, we cannot. And I think that's definitely something I'm taking away from this conversation, is thinking about grief as something that is communal and that you do need support for. And that's okay for that to be part of the process.
Yeah. And you can see, if we hover up here and look at the big picture, we look at the mosque attacks in Christchurch. What actually helped was that just brought the whole community together. Everybody united together, and I know for me, I just wanted to go to that memorial centre. I wanted to put flowers there. I wanted to write a message because we were all in this together. These people obviously were the ones that took the brunt of it, but this was a community grief. And like it was almost as though I needed to go and be in that space. And there was just, and it provided meaning, but it was also a physical space that helped me try and work it through with the the spiritual why.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great example of both doing something tangible, something sensing, and almost and intuitive and spiritual at the same time. Those two things coming together to help in that space of collective grief.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. So, it's not a matter of getting too tied up with this of is it spirit, is it sensing, or is it intuitive, or is it feeling, is it thinking? Because I think they do work together, because it's sort of like we can do something, but the why of why we do it, like I can do something quite sensing, like light a candle, but the reason I do it is probably different than if somebody was a sensing type, yeah,
absolutely. So anything else you want to share from your research about grieving, or things we may not have covered?
I don't think so. I think we've done a lot.
I think we have.
We've covered a lot. Yeah, we've done a lot. And I think the good thing that comes out, that bubbles up, is that we are individuals. We do it differently, So this is just a bit of a tool that can give you a bit of a lens of what, rather than be the laser that actually you have to follow.
And feeling that you have permission to grieve in a way that is right for you. I think, in a society that doesn't, enable grief, we have to give ourselves permission to go, no, this is what I need to do, and this is how long it's going to take me, and to just be okay with that.
Yeah. It's so right. Yeah. Well,
thank you for sharing your research and insights with us and with me. This has been fantastic. I've really appreciated it. I love this research. I love how practical it is, and I love how much permission it gives people to understand different ways to grieve. Thank you so much. I really appreciated it.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
You're so welcome. And for those listening, if you would like to talk to Clare, her contact details are on the screen. You can contact her anytime. She is in New Zealand, which you've probably picked up from this conversation. But I'm sure she works internationally as well.
I do.
Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, and go well in what you're doing.
Thanks. It's been great.